It was a cool Friday evening when Jamal left school. His backpack, filled with heavy books, hung loosely from his shoulders as he walked down the street. He was looking forward to a relaxing evening at home with his younger brother, Malik, and his older sister, Maya. Life on the streets was tough, but Jamal had learned to survive. His family was close, and they always supported each other. He had learned to ignore the stares and whispers of people who didn't understand what it was like growing up in a neighborhood like theirs. As he walked, Jamal noticed the quietness of the street. Normally, there was some noise. Cars honking, kids laughing, or people talking on their phones. But tonight it was different. The cool breeze in the air only made the stillness more eerie. He didn't think much of it at first. He was just ready to get home, relax, and maybe catch up on some homework. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a car screeched to a halt just a few feet away from him. Jamal jumped back, startled. The sound of tires skidding echoed in the street as the car nearly lost control, skidding along the wet asphalt. It was a luxury car, the kind that looked completely out of place in this neighborhood. The engine hummed loudly as it stopped just inches away from him. Jamal's heart raced as he took a step back. The car door swung open, and a tall man in a police uniform stepped out. He was wearing sunglasses, even though it was already evening. Jamal didn't know the man, but the uniform caught his attention. The man's face looked tense, and his eyes were cold. He quickly scanned Jamal from head to toe before glaring at him. "You look suspicious," the officer said, his voice rough and impatient. Jamal froze for a moment. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just walking home from school. But the officer was already moving closer, his eyes narrowing as he got closer to Jamal. There was something about the way the officer was looking at him that made Jamal's stomach twist. "I'm just heading home," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer didn't seem to care. His eyes narrowed even more as he stepped even closer to Jamal, getting in his personal space. "You're not supposed to be on this street at this time. You look like trouble." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this wasn't going to end well. He had heard stories of cops acting unfairly toward people in his neighborhood, but he never thought it would happen to him. He tried to stay calm, but his hands were trembling slightly. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I just want to go home," Jamal said, hoping the officer would back off. But the officer didn't listen. Instead, his eyes flashed with anger. Without warning, he raised his hand and slapped Jamal hard across the face. The force of the slap made Jamal's head snap to the side. His face burned with pain and humiliation, and his legs nearly buckled under him. For a moment, Jamal stood there, stunned and speechless. The officer stood in front of him, not showing any sign of remorse. His cold eyes locked onto Jamal's, as if daring him to say something. Jamal couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been slapped by a police officer, and for no reason at all. Jamal's thoughts raced. Was he being targeted just because of where he lived? Just because of the color of his skin? He could feel the sting on his cheek, but even worse was the deep sense of injustice that settled in his chest. He had never felt more powerless in his life. But Jamal wasn't going to let it go. He wasn't going to let the officer treat him like this without speaking up. He clenched his fists, trying to control the anger rising within him. But before he could say anything, the officer stepped back and reached for his radio. "Stay where you are. I'm calling for backup," the officer said. His voice was cold and commanding, like he was used to getting his way. Jamal's chest tightened. This was turning into a nightmare. He had to get away before things got even worse. He turned quickly and walked away, not looking back. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had the officer done that? Why had he treated him like that? As Jamal walked, the sting of the slap lingered. His cheek burned, but it wasn't just the physical pain that hurt. It was the feeling of being unfairly judged, of being treated like he was less than human. He had always been taught to respect the law, but this experience made him question everything. How could he trust the police when they treated him like this? He didn't know how he was going to tell his family about what had just happened. He was scared of what would happen if he spoke out, but he also couldn't ignore the injustice he had just faced. He had been slapped by a police officer for no reason other than the color of his skin. Jamal walked home that night with his head held high, even though inside, his heart was heavy. He knew this wasn't the end. The incident would stay with him, and it would change the way he saw the world from now on. The question was, what would he do about it? The unexpected revelation. The night was still heavy with the sting of what had just happened. Jamal barely made it home before his mind began to spiral. The slap was still fresh on his face, and no matter how hard he tried to shake it off, it wouldn't go away. His mother, Deja, was busy in the kitchen preparing dinner when he walked through the door, but the moment she saw his face, she stopped. "Jamal, what happened to you?" Deja's voice was filled with concern as she rushed to him. Her eyes were wide with worry, taking in the red mark on his cheek. I was just walking home, Mom," Jamal began, trying to keep his voice steady. "A cop just slapped me. I don't know why." Deja's face went pale. She paused for a moment, as if she was trying to understand the weight of her son's words. Jamal could see the shock in her eyes, and he hated that he had to explain something like this to her. "Which cop?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal didn't know. The cop had been wearing sunglasses, and he hadn't even bothered to ask his name. He only remembered the cold, harsh look in his eyes. "I don't know his name, but he was in a black uniform." He had this smug look on his face. It was like he didn't even care. Deja exhaled deeply, pressing a hand to her forehead as if trying to calm the storm of emotions building inside her. She knew this was bad. Jamal didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the first time someone from their family had been targeted by the police in such a manner. Deja's heart sank as she tried to process the injustice her son had just faced. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Jamal," she said softly. "But we'll figure this out. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again." But Jamal wasn't sure if anything could make it right. His mind raced with thoughts of how powerless he felt. He wasn't a criminal. He didn't even do anything wrong. So why had this happened? "I just want to forget it happened," Jamal said, turning away from her. "But it keeps coming back. I don't understand. Why does this always happen to people like me?" Deja's heart broke as she watched her son, the person she had fought so hard to protect, now questioning his place in the world. She knew this wasn't just about one cop. This was about something much deeper, a cycle of racism that had been going on for years. The next morning, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over him. He had gone to bed early, hoping that sleep would bring some peace, but the slap and the words from the officer kept echoing in his mind. He hadn't told his sister Maya yet, but he knew it wouldn't be long before she found out. She always had a way of knowing when something was wrong. As Jamal was getting ready for school, Deja came into his room. She was holding a piece of paper, and her face was filled with determination. "Jamal, we're not letting this go," she said firmly, her voice calm but strong. "I've been talking to some people, and I think I might know who that cop was." Jamal turned to her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Deja handed him the paper. "I spoke with some folks in the neighborhood, and they told me about an officer who's been causing problems recently. His name is Officer Harris. He's known for targeting young black men, and he's gotten away with it because no one has spoken up." Jamal took the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. Officer Harris. The name didn't mean anything to him at first, but as soon as he saw the officer's picture, a wave of recognition hit him. It was the same officer, the one who had slapped him, the one who had treated him like he was invisible. "So, what now?" Jamal asked, his voice quiet. "We're going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed," Deja replied firmly. "I'll file a complaint, and if I have to, I'll talk to the media." "You don't deserve to be treated like that, Jamal. Nobody does." Jamal was still processing the shock of everything. Officer Harris wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a bigger problem, one that he had always known about, but never fully understood until now. It was hard for him to wrap his mind around the idea that someone in authority could act like this without facing consequences. As Jamal prepared to head out, his mother pulled him into a hug. "We're going to fight for justice, Jamal. You don't have to carry this alone. We're stronger than this." Jamal didn't know if he felt stronger yet, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let Officer Harris get away with this. He was determined to stand up for himself, for the people in his neighborhood, and for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. The next day at school, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The halls felt colder than usual, and he couldn't escape the thought of what had happened. It felt like the world had shifted in a way he couldn't control. But then, as he was walking to his first class, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A police officer was standing at the door of the school. He was looking right at Jamal. The officer's gaze was intense, like he had been waiting for this moment. Jamal stopped in his tracks, suddenly feeling like his entire body was frozen. The officer was still staring at him, but he didn't move. Jamal didn't know what to think. Was this Officer Harris? Was this his way of intimidating Jamal into silence? His heart pounded in his chest as he walked past the officer, doing his best to keep his head held high. The tension in the air was thick. Jamal knew one thing for sure. The story wasn't over. This fight was just beginning. The confrontation. Jamal couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled deep inside him. His encounter with Officer Harris had left him feeling vulnerable, yet something inside him burned with a quiet resolve. He refused to let the officer's actions go unnoticed. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, anyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. That afternoon, Jamal walked through the school hallways, his thoughts racing. He was determined to find out more about Officer Harris, to uncover the truth. His friends noticed his quiet demeanor and approached him. "Yo, what's up with you today, Jamal? You're acting kind of distant," his best friend Kyle asked, tapping him on the shoulder. Jamal hesitated, unsure if he was ready to open up. But then he thought about how much Kyle had always been there for him, how he had been his rock. Maybe it was time to share. "You won't believe what happened to me yesterday," Jamal began, his voice low but steady. "A cop slapped me. Out of nowhere. And I don't even know why." Kyle's eyes widened in shock. "What? No way. Are you serious?" Jamal nodded, feeling the anger rise inside him once more. "Yeah. And the worst part, I didn't even do anything wrong. I was just walking down the street, minding my business. But he didn't care." "Damn, man. That's messed up," Kyle said, clenching his fists. "But you're not just gonna let it slide, right?" Jamal shook his head. "No, I'm not. I'm gonna do something about it." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I think I know who he is," Jamal said, his voice becoming more confident. "He's Officer Harris. I heard people talk about him. Apparently, he's known for doing stuff like this, and I'm not just gonna sit back and let him get away with it." Kyle's face softened. "You know, Jamal, if you go after him, it's gonna get messy. Cops don't like to be exposed like that. It could cause some serious problems." "I know," Jamal replied, his jaw clenched. "But I'm not backing down. People need to know what kind of person he really is." Kyle sighed, clearly torn. "You're brave, man. Just be careful. Not all cops are bad, but if this guy's really been causing trouble, then he deserves to be exposed." Jamal nodded, appreciating his friend's support. But deep down, he knew that the truth had to come out. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated or misunderstood because of their race. As Jamal and Kyle walked toward the school courtyard, Jamal's thoughts raced. He needed to find a way to gather proof, something concrete that would help expose Officer Harris. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to talk to someone who understood the system, someone who could help him navigate the legal and social challenges that lay ahead. That night, Jamal decided to reach out to his mother. She had always been the one to guide him through tough situations, the one who had taught him how to fight for justice. It was time to share what he had learned about Officer Harris. "Mom, I think I know who the cop was," Jamal said, sitting down at the kitchen table with his mother. "His name is Officer Harris." Deeja's face tightened when she heard the name. "I've heard of him," she said softly. "He's been in the news a few times. Not for good reasons. He's known for harassing black people. But no one's ever done anything about it." Jamal's heart sank. He had feared this might be the case. "I want to do something about it. I don't want him to get away with what he did to me." Deeja reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on her son's. "We'll make sure he doesn't. I'll help you, Jamal. We'll figure out a way to make this right." Jamal felt a surge of relief. He had always known that his mother would be there for him, no matter what. But now, more than ever, he realized just how important it was to have someone in his corner, someone who understood the weight of the world on his shoulders. The next day, Jamal and Deeja began their plan. They would gather evidence, talk to witnesses, and try to find a way to make Officer Harris accountable for his actions. Jamal knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew that going up against the police wasn't something to take lightly, but he also knew that he couldn't stay silent. Later that afternoon, Jamal walked through the school courtyard again. This time, he wasn't alone. Kyle had agreed to help him gather information, and together they began asking around. They talked to other students who had seen the incident, hoping someone had witnessed the officer's actions. It wasn't long before they found someone who had been at the scene. A girl named Tanya approached them, her eyes full of concern. "I saw everything that happened," she said quietly. "I was standing on the corner when the cops slapped you. It wasn't right. He didn't even give you a chance to explain yourself." Jamal's heart raced. He hadn't expected someone to speak up so quickly. Tanya continued, "I can tell you everything I saw, if you want. Maybe it'll help." Jamal nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. This was the break he needed. With Tanya's testimony, Jamal knew they were one step closer to exposing Officer Harris for the wrongs he had committed. But he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The fight was far from over. The discovery. The days after Tanya's testimony felt like a blur to Jamal. He and Kyle had spent countless hours piecing together the evidence, trying to build a case that would expose Officer Harris for the person he truly was. They had gathered all the information they could, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something crucial that would make their case irrefutable. One afternoon, as Jamal sat at the library, flipping through old news articles on his phone, a headline caught his eye. It was about Officer Harris, a profile piece written by a local reporter. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he read the article. Officer Harris, a long-standing member of the police force, has faced multiple allegations of racial discrimination. Despite the accusations, he has never been formally investigated, the article read. Jamal's pulse quickened. This was it, the breakthrough he had been waiting for. It seemed like Officer Harris's pattern of behavior went much deeper than he had realized. Jamal leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The truth was right in front of him, and now he had to figure out how to use it. But first, he needed to talk to his mother. Deeja had always been the one to guide him through these kinds of situations, and he needed her insight more than ever. That evening, Jamal sat down with his mother in their small living room. The room was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of the TV providing light. He could see the worry lines on Deeja's face, but her eyes were steady, full of determination. "Mom, I found something," Jamal said, holding up his phone. "I found an article about Officer Harris. It says he's been accused of racial discrimination before, but nothing ever happened. They never investigated him. It's like he's been getting away with it for years." Deeja took a deep breath, her expression unreadable. "I've heard rumors about him before, Jamal. People have said things, but no one's ever had the courage to speak up. If what you're telling me is true, then this could be bigger than just what happened to you. Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of his mother's words. I know, but I don't know where to start. How do we make sure he's held accountable for what he's done? Deja looked at him, her eyes fierce with a resolve Jamal had never seen before. We go straight to the people who can make a difference. We find a lawyer, someone who can help us make sure Officer Harris faces the consequences of his actions. And we keep gathering evidence. We don't stop until the truth is known. Jamal felt a surge of hope. For the first time since the attack, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. He had his mother by his side. And together, they were going to make sure Officer Harris could no longer hide behind his badge. The next day, Jamal and Deja met with a civil rights attorney named Mr. Daniels. He was a quiet, serious man, but there was a fire in his eyes when he heard Jamal's story. He listened carefully, taking notes as Jamal recounted the attack and everything that had happened since. I believe you, Jamal, Mr. Daniels said after a long pause. I've seen cases like this before. This is not just an isolated incident. This is part of a larger problem, and we're going to make sure it gets the attention it deserves. Jamal felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Taking on the police was no small task, but he couldn't back down now, not when they were so close to exposing the truth. As Mr. Daniels left, he gave Jamal a reassuring smile. We'll get to work right away. You've done the right thing by coming forward, Jamal. And together, we'll make sure Officer Harris can't hurt anyone else. Jamal's heart swelled with gratitude. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the fight for justice would truly begin. But little did he know, the battle was far from over. Officer Harris wasn't going to go down without a fight. Later that week, Jamal's life took an unexpected turn. He received a call from an unknown number. Hesitant at first, he answered. Jamal, this is Officer Thompson. The voice on the other end said. I need to talk to you. It's about Officer Harris. Jamal's heart raced. What did this mean? Was it a trap? Or was Officer Thompson on his side? I don't have much time, Officer Thompson continued. I know things haven't been easy for you, but you need to be careful. Harris, he's not who he says he is. He's got a lot of power, and he'll do whatever it takes to keep his secrets safe. Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. He knew this was it, the moment that would change everything. Officer Harris had a reputation, and it seemed like there were people who knew the truth but were too afraid to speak up. But Jamal wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready to bring everything to light. I appreciate you reaching out, Jamal said, his voice steady. But I'm not backing down. I'm going to make sure Harris faces the consequences of what he did to me and to everyone else he's hurt. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Officer Thompson spoke again. Be careful, Jamal. There's a lot at stake here, but I'll help you. You're not alone. With those final words, the call ended. Jamal sat there for a moment, processing everything that had just been said. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt like he had an ally in this fight. Someone who had the courage to stand up to Officer Harris. The discovery of the truth had only just begun. But Jamal was ready, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The unraveling truth. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jamal, with the help of his mother, continued to gather evidence to build their case against Officer Harris. Every piece of information, every witness statement, seemed to inch them closer to bringing him down. Yet, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was always one step behind them. The phone call from Officer Thompson weighed heavily on Jamal's mind. He wondered who else might be out there, hidden in the shadows, willing to help. Was there anyone else who had seen the real Officer Harris, or were they all too afraid to speak up? It was late one evening when Jamal received an unexpected visit. He had just finished going over some documents with his mom when the doorbell rang. It was almost too late for visitors, but Jamal opened the door anyway, his heart beating faster with each step. Standing there was a woman in her mid-30s, with short brown hair and sharp, determined eyes. She wore a suit that looked a bit too formal for a late-night visit, and her expression was unreadable. "Jamal, right?" she asked in a calm voice. Jamal nodded, feeling a rush of confusion. "Who are you?" "I'm Detective Riley," the woman replied. "I've been looking into Officer Harris. I know what he did to you, and I need your help." Jamal's eyes narrowed. Was this some kind of trick? Was this another way for Harris's supporters to silence him? But then he remembered Officer Thompson's warning. Maybe, just maybe, this was someone on his side. He stepped back to let her in. "What do you want from me?" Detective Riley glanced around before sitting down. "I've been investigating Harris for a while now. I've seen the patterns, the cover-ups, the way he's manipulated the system, and I know what he did to you. But here's the thing. No one will listen to me unless we have concrete proof. And you've got that." Jamal felt a mixture of hope and skepticism. "You're saying you're willing to help me, to expose him?" Riley nodded. "I've been trying to take him down for years, but I can't do it alone. Harris has too many people on his side. I can't just walk in and arrest him. But with your help, we might have enough to bring him down." Jamal was silent for a moment, weighing her words. Could he trust her? He thought about everything he'd been through. The attack, the pain, the fear. But more than that, he thought about the countless other victims of Harris's brutality, people who had suffered in silence because no one dared to stand up. "I'm in," Jamal finally said, his voice firm. "I want him held accountable for what he did." Detective Riley's expression softened. "Good, but we need to be careful. Harris is a dangerous man, and he'll stop at nothing to protect his reputation. We'll need to be smart about this." Over the next few weeks, Jamal worked closely with Detective Riley. They spent long hours going through evidence, talking to witnesses, and trying to piece together the full extent of Harris's wrongdoings. It became clear that Harris had been hiding behind his badge for far too long, using his power to control and intimidate anyone who dared to question him. The more Jamal learned, the more determined he became. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone Harris had hurt. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. But with every passing day, the pressure mounted. Jamal received more threatening phone calls, warning him to back off. Strange cars seemed to be following him wherever he went. He even found his apartment door unlocked one morning, as if someone had been inside while he was asleep. It was clear that Harris wasn't going to let this go easily. But Jamal wasn't scared. He had come too far to turn back now. One evening, as Jamal and Detective Riley sat in a dimly lit cafe, going over their strategy, she looked at him with a concerned expression. "You know this won't be easy," she said quietly. "We're dealing with someone who has a lot of power. Harris isn't just some rogue cop. He's part of a larger system. Taking him down could mean exposing a lot of people." Jamal nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew that going after Harris could lead to a far greater battle. It could unravel an entire network of corruption that extended beyond Harris himself. But Jamal wasn't afraid anymore. The truth had to come out, no matter who it hurt or how dangerous it was. "I'm ready," Jamal said, his voice steady. "Let's take him down." Detective Riley smiled faintly, impressed by his resolve. "We're close, Jamal. Very close. But we need one final piece of the puzzle. We need Harris to slip up, make a mistake. And when he does, we'll be ready to expose him." The next few days were filled with tension and anticipation. Jamal could feel the walls closing in, the pressure building. He knew that it was only a matter of time before Harris made his move. But Jamal wasn't going to let him get away with it. He was ready to fight, no matter the cost. As Jamal sat in his room, staring at the files spread out in front of him, he couldn't help but think of how far he had come. From the moment Harris attacked him, his life had been turned upside down. But now, he was on the verge of taking down a corrupt system, and he was determined to see it through. The fight for justice was far from over, but Jamal was no longer alone. He had allies now, People who believed in him and were willing to risk everything to expose the truth. And as he prepared for the next move, Jamal knew one thing for sure. Officer Harris's days of hiding behind a badge were numbered. The truth was coming, and nothing would stop it. The final confrontation. The days were ticking down, and Jamal could feel the weight of everything that was about to happen. The walls that had once felt safe now seemed to be closing in around him. He knew that Officer Harris would soon realize that Jamal and Detective Riley were closing in on him. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Harris wasn't someone who would go down without a fight. Jamal had received another threatening message. This time, it was in the form of a letter slipped under his door. It was simple and chilling. Stay away, or you'll regret it. He had learned by now that Harris was capable of anything, but Jamal wasn't afraid. He had already made the decision to stand up for what was right. There was no turning back. Despite the threats, Jamal and Detective Riley continued to gather evidence. They had one last piece of the puzzle that could take Harris down. It was a video. A surveillance video from a nearby store that captured Harris meeting with some shady figures, exchanging money under the cover of darkness. The footage was clear. It showed Harris in a way that no one could deny. This was the final proof they needed to expose him. Jamal wasn't sure how he felt as he watched the video. His heart pounded in his chest. The man who had attacked him, the one who had abused his power for so long, was finally going to be brought to justice. But the truth came with a price. He knew Harris would do everything in his power to fight back, and that meant Jamal and his family were at risk. Detective Riley looked at him with a stern expression. "We're going to go public with this, Jamal. We've done everything we can quietly. But now we have to make sure everyone knows the truth. Harris needs to be exposed to the world." Jamal nodded. "I'm ready. I want him to pay for what he did." But as they prepared to take the video to the news station, something unexpected happened. Jamal received a call from his mother, her voice shaky. "Jamal, someone's been asking about you. They've been following you, watching everything you do." His stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "They know what's going on, Jamal," his mom continued. "I think they're going to make their move soon." Jamal's mind raced. Harris was closing in, and his family was at risk. But there was no turning back. If he stepped down now, everything they had worked for would be in vain. The moment of truth arrived. Jamal and Detective Riley made their way to the news station, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were about to change everything. They had already made the arrangements to meet the reporter who would help them break the story wide open. As they walked through the doors of the station, Jamal felt a rush of adrenaline. His nerves were on edge. This was the moment they had all been working for. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Would this truly be the end of Harris's reign of terror, or would Jamal's life be in even greater danger? The reporter, a young woman named Claire, met them with a professional but friendly smile. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady. Jamal didn't speak right away. He just nodded. Detective Riley spoke up. "We have everything we need. It's time to expose Officer Harris for the corrupt man he is." Claire led them to a small conference room, where they sat down to review the video one last time. Jamal felt a surge of anger as the video played. There was Harris, meeting with criminals, exchanging money. The man who had hurt him, who had hurt so many others, was finally going to be exposed. But just as they were about to finalize the details, Claire's phone rang. She answered quickly, her face going pale. Jamal could tell something was wrong. She listened for a moment, her eyes darting nervously to the door. "I see," she said, her voice cold. "We'll be in touch." She hung up, and Jamal could see the concern in her eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, his heart racing. "The story's already out," Claire said quietly. "Someone leaked the video before we could go public." Jamal's blood ran cold. Someone had beaten them to it. Harris must have had his own people working behind the scenes. He had anticipated their every move. The video was already on the internet, and now it was too late to stop it. But even as panic set in, Jamal realized something. The truth was already out. People knew now. The video was out there for everyone to see. And it didn't matter who had leaked it. What mattered was that Officer Harris's actions were no longer a secret. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, media interviews, and frantic attempts to control the narrative. Jamal's phone buzzed constantly, messages from friends and family pouring in, offering support, but also expressing their fear for what might happen next. Detective Riley was on the phone, coordinating with her team, trying to ensure that Harris couldn't escape justice. Meanwhile, Jamal's mind kept going back to the moment when everything would change. He had started this fight as a victim, but now he was a symbol of resilience. The final confrontation was coming. Harris would be held accountable, and no matter how far he tried to run or how deep his connections went, Jamal knew one thing for sure: justice was inevitable. The next morning, Jamal saw the headlines everywhere. The video had gone viral. Officer Harris was no longer untouchable, and while Jamal knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he felt a surge of hope. The fight was just beginning, but with the truth on his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The moment of reckoning. The news had spread like wildfire. Officer Harris's corrupt dealings were exposed to the world, and his days of hiding in the shadows were over. But for Jamal, the road ahead was far from simple. The victory felt hollow, knowing the dangers that still lurked around every corner. Harris had made powerful enemies in the police force and beyond. As the investigation deepened, Jamal knew he was only one step away from being a target once more. Jamal sat quietly in his living room, staring out the window. The world outside had changed, but the weight of the situation still pressed down on him. His phone buzzed again, another message from Detective Riley. "We're closing in on Harris. It won't be long now. Stay safe." He couldn't help but wonder if that was true. How long before the corrupt cop, desperate and cornered, would try to silence him? The phone call from his mother that morning had added to the unease. "Jamal," she had said, her voice full of worry, "they're talking about what happened at school. People are afraid. They say Harris might do something drastic." "I know, Mom," Jamal had responded, his heart heavy. "But we're doing the right thing. We have to see this through." He knew his mother was scared. She had always wanted to protect him, to keep him safe from the dangers of the world. But he couldn't back down now. Harris had hurt too many people. He had threatened too many lives, and Jamal wasn't going to let him destroy any more. Detective Riley had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, piecing together the evidence that would put Harris away for good. But even as the case seemed to be moving forward, there were whispers of corruption within the police force. There were those who still stood by Harris, those who would do anything to protect their own. Jamal couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not when everything was so close to unraveling. He glanced at the clock. The press conference was in a few hours. Jamal had been asked to speak, to tell his side of the story, to stand before the cameras and show the world that justice had to be served. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. The spotlight had never been something he had sought, but now it was unavoidable. As he dressed for the event, his mind raced. What if Harris wasn't done fighting? What if his connections were deeper than they had realized? The fear gnawed at him, but he shoved it aside. He had a responsibility now, a duty to the people who had supported him, to the ones who had believed in him. He couldn't let them down. The press conference was held in a large conference room, cameras flashing as reporters scrambled for a glimpse of Jamal. The tension in the air was palpable. Jamal stood at the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. Detective Riley stood behind him, her presence a quiet reassurance. The reporters began shouting questions. "Jamal, how does it feel to have your attacker exposed? Do you think Officer Harris will face charges? What's next for you? How has this changed your life?" Jamal took a deep breath. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for all the victims, for everyone who had been hurt by Harris's corruption. "I'm here today because I believe in justice," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the storm of questions. "I believe that no one, no matter who they are, should be above the law." Officer Harris thought he could get away with his actions, but he's wrong. The truth is out, and now it's time for him to face the consequences. The crowd fell silent for a moment, taking in his words. Then one reporter asked, "Are you afraid? Harris still has people in the force. Are you worried for your safety?" Jamal paused. He wasn't going to lie. He was scared, but fear wasn't going to stop him. "Yes," he said honestly, "I'm scared, but I'm not backing down. This is bigger than me. It's about standing up for what's right." The press conference continued, and Jamal answered more questions, each one more intense than the last. But as the final question came, something changed in him. He felt a surge of strength. He had told the truth, and no matter what came next, he knew he had done the right thing. As the conference ended and Jamal stepped away from the podium, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small flicker of hope. Officer Harris might still try to fight back, but the public was behind him now. There was no turning back. The next few days were a blur. Jamal stayed with family, avoiding public places as much as possible. The news cycle was relentless. Harris's trial was fast approaching, and the media attention was at an all-time high. But despite the chaos, Jamal knew that the battle wasn't over yet. The day of the trial arrived. Jamal sat in the courtroom, his heart racing. He glanced at Harris, who sat across the room, surrounded by his lawyers. The once cocky officer now looked small, vulnerable. The walls that had protected him were crumbling, and Jamal knew that this was the final showdown. When the verdict was announced, it was everything Jamal had hoped for. Harris was found guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in applause as justice was finally served. But for Jamal, the victory was bittersweet. He had won, but the scars of the past would never fully heal. Yet, as he walked out of the courthouse, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had faced his fears, and in the end, justice had prevailed. The world had changed. Harris was behind bars, and Jamal could finally move forward, knowing that the fight for justice was never in vain. The battle was over, but the victory was his.